we've had this brother back. He's getting a bit of a reputation for being a bookworm and a wordsmith, especially on our Craftsman Online blog. Especially on our Craftsman Online blog, where he's been contributing book reports on some of these titles that he's read. Brother Jonathan Kopel, welcome back to the podcast, brother.
Good to be here.
So we're going to be diving into Siddhartha, and I was telling you before we get started with the taping for this episode, I would have never, ever discovered this book or Hermann Hesse if it hadn't been for you. This is one of those things that was just completely off my radar. I was so fascinated, listening to other people and also getting your input on the book, and we'll get into that and how it is a quick page turn, but also kind of the story of Hermann Hesse. He is a brother. This book was written back in 1922. It came after he traveled to Sri Lanka and Indonesia and was really inspired by that trip before World War I. And kind of like you, I found that there's a parallel here. This was a guy at a certain point in his life, Hermann Hesse, who was on his own spiritual quest. And I know a lot of the conversations that you and I have shared personally and also here on the podcast, are the parallels of lessons of Freemasonry and how to apply that in our spiritual life. I'm just curious, how did you discover this book and what did you get out of it?
No, I think the start of it, this was actually introduced to me by another brother in one of the lodges that I visit routinely. And I didn't really understand why he had mentioned for me to read this book until I started reading it. But it was more of a happenstance that I came across it. In fact, if you type in Siddhartha online, the book won't even show up most of the time because most people will read Siddhartha and go to the Buddha and read the entire history of the Buddha and go into Buddhism. Mm-hmm. But if you type in Siddhartha, you actually have to type in his full name, the author, because of that overlap between it. So I'm not surprised I never came across it. But when I reached out to other mentors of mine, it turns out that people that are, I would say, more humanities and more literature inclined are very familiar with this book.
And it's not the thickest book that's out there, which is good. So
right.
If you're just looking for kind of a quick page turner, a light read, you'll dig this. And I think a lot of readers are going to kind of stumble into it the same way I did and go, wait, is this the story of the Buddha that's happening here?
I think that was my initial thought, because I read the book and I admittedly thought, oh, am I already going to know what's going to happen in this story? And oddly enough, it completely turns the story on its head. In fact, what stood out to me was how the main character in the story, Siddhartha, turns out to have his own disagreements with the Buddha and with different characters in the book. And it becomes more of his personal journey rather than saying, oh, the Buddha was completely right. It's more of saying, well, what if the Buddha is wrong? Like, how do I figure out what is true based on my life experiences and the journey that I'm on, and not clinging to what one person is saying, even if they might be right on a lot of different points. I thought that dialogue was very poignant for a lot of the discussions I've had with other Masons in the lodge, as well as some of the themes within Freemasonry as a whole.
Look, we're going to get into some of those themes and some of the crossovers that exist here between Siddhartha and our Masonic ritual. We covered, what drew you into it. We teased a little bit that there's parallels between Siddhartha and the story of the Buddha, which they're not connected. They're not related. It's just the author Hesse was kind of borrowing and inspired by some of those themes. If you could give us like your snapshot of what this story is all about.
If I were to give you an elevator pitch, I would say, imagine if Siddhartha, instead of trying to find enlightenment through the classic Buddhist perception, instead this character is more about arguing with the Buddha and having their own journey of discovery and finding what is the common theme that matters amongst all these different faiths and traditions. What is it that really resonates amongst them all? That's the way I would sort of describe this story.
Yeah. One of the themes that I saw as a takeaway was the idea that wisdom can't be taught. that life experiences are that have to be experienced. And that's what this character decided to do, was kind of what you're pointing to. Instead of reading the classic teachings or the ancient mysteries or the wisdom that existed at that time, he was like, well, you know what, the best way to do this is to go just do it.
Right.
Do you find that, to be kind of an interesting or maybe even profound statement for somebody kind of your age at your life, starting in your career and also getting started in your Masonic career as well?
Maybe a few years ago I may have said that. I think that the more that I've experienced within my profession, especially coming to DC and learning from the different lodges too, I think it's been more emphasized on practicing that. But I think it takes a lot
Mm,
of mentorship and guidance to learn. Not necessarily, I don't want to say how to do it. Like there's a formula that if you do it this way, it's going to give you all the answers or whatnot. But I think the most important lesson is learning the process by which you do that is the most important thing, rather than saying this is the right way. It's what process gives you the certain outcome that you're looking for or what you're really trying to understand. And I think that really reading this book was more of an emphasis on that same journey of not only understanding why knowing yourself is important, but also understanding how people can get drawn to different directions that aren't necessarily wrong, but they're less difficult, but they sort of avoid the fundamental existential questions that take a lot of effort and time. And I would even argue some discomfort in the sense of being exposed to things that really challenge your perceptions and your own beliefs, and being able to come to terms with that discomfort.
mm. One of the themes in the book, as you kind of touched on, was the concept of seeking. And it got me thinking of one of our early Masonic truth seekers, Brother Manly P. Hall, who
Mhm.
wrote encyclopedias literally
Right.
about his search for light. How do you find that concept of Siddhartha always seeking, going out, living, aligning? Do you see that at all with your Masonic journey?
I would say yes. I think mine wasn't intentional. I think it was more of, I think looking at it was being curious, but also sincere, because I think
Mm,
there's people that can be curious but insincere and they don't necessarily go together. In other words, I think that what it took for me was following my natural inclination to learn and understand, but then finding other people within the lodge or outside that could guide that in directions that I didn't expect nor really understood until I started reading and reflecting on things myself. And I think the benefit of what they did was they didn't say, read this book because it will tell you this. It was, read this book and let me know what you think.
mm.
I think that process of pointing the direction, but then letting yourself be able to take time to think about it within your own life and circumstances, I think gives the best outcome with not forcing an interpretation, but allowing you to find what you need to learn at your particular stage in life. And I think that's maybe the biggest lesson I've learned is that truth is sometimes there in front of you, but you're not able to see it because you're not ready to understand it because you're still dealing with other things that are as important, but not necessarily what you need at that moment.
Mm. So throughout the story, Siddhartha, and I can already see another parallel here, he encounters a lot of different teachers and paths.
Yeah.
And, one of the things I loved about this book is that the Joseph Campbell, hero of a thousand journeys, that hero arc is somewhat familiar here.
Mhm.
So there's that structure that we get, but then there's also just like the concept of various teachers and paths. And I immediately started thinking of, okay, obviously there's the path that you follow to knock on the first Masonic lodge that you want to seek to become a member of. There's the steps that you take through our ritual when you're doing the obligations and going through the degrees. And then there's everything that happens after that, like the true paths of enlightenment that begin to present themselves once you become a master mason. That one I can understand. How about the various teachers? Can you speak to that, like the important role of mentors and how they helped Siddhartha through his journey?
So it's interesting because Siddhartha, unlike the other characters, starts out initially looking for, I wouldn't say a mentor, but some guidance. In other words, he's looking for a group of people or someone to give him some answer. And he goes to the ascetics initially in the story. And he goes with a friend of his. And through all that, he becomes more disenchanted with it because he realizes that their own philosophical system is never ending. There's never really a solid answer. It becomes sort of this, you could even say philosophically, it's more of, it is a redundant answer in that the question gives you an answer that then goes back and it's circular reasoning almost. And he wasn't satisfied. He's not satisfied with that. And as he goes along the journey and meets, initially at one point, he sees the Buddha, his friend was, becomes drawn to it and says, well, I want to follow this. This is the path that will lead me to where I need to go. And the Buddha has that same discussion. He's like, do you want to stay? And the conversation that really stood out to me was the line where he tells the Buddha, if I stay with you, my fear is I will lose myself and I will no longer be who I am and what I need to learn. And that was kind of counterintuitive for the Buddha. He wasn't expecting that answer, but it was the idea that if I became your student, I would be trying to learn your truth, but it wouldn't necessarily be the truth that I need to learn for what I was here to learn. In other words, it would be, I'm learning something that is important and probably true, but it's not the truth that I need to learn myself and the one that probably other people need to learn. But it's not something that this teacher can give me. It's something that I have to experience in my own life and story rather than trying to follow the story of another person to give me that meaning. And I think that was an interesting theme for a person in the 1800s to actually write this at that time in the culture he was originally from. I thought that was very interesting and how he had that insight into himself as well as the underlying story that he was trying to tell within Siddhartha.
Yeah. And it's an interesting concept as well, because I'm also looking at this through the Masonic lens, and the way that we structure a lot of our Masonic education, especially when it's the portion of you go in, you take your first degree, here's what you need to know about that so that you can get passed and take your fellow craft degree so that you can eventually go through that and then become raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason. There's nothing officially, I would say, across all of the jurisdictions that we say, oh, you must do this. You must. Each lodge and each jurisdiction has its own way of providing that path of education. But there are key things that we touch on, which I think are really interesting. And that's the part that got to me, Masonically speaking. It's that, yeah, you can work with a mentor who can help you work on your catechism so that you can, prove up and go from an EA to a fellow craft degree. Fantastic. But then you're going to interact with another brother in the lodge who may not present himself as a mentor or a teacher, but he could be, parallel to what Siddhartha was looking for, somebody with some experience, and they could talk about something completely different in that first degree or that second degree or even the third degree that wasn't on your radar because it wasn't the quote unquote prescribed learning, lesson that you were going through at that time. And that's when you're just like, wow, I feel like I just got a gem. I feel like I just discovered a treasure chest full of new ideas. Like there's this energy that comes. And that's one of the things I like to hear you talk about is you've traveled a lot now as a new Master Mason who've been doing few years, and you're coming across and meeting all these new brothers with all these new ideas. How is that changing or enhancing or improving, or how's that affecting your path that you're walking?
I think it's given me a lot more to learn. I think that it's more of an awareness of how each person you meet teaches you by simply being themselves a lot of lessons or even skills, or I would even say more of an awareness of areas to improve on that you wouldn't otherwise learn within your own group of people that you commonly associate with. So I'll give you an example. So if you're in, as in my field, like around physicians or around healthcare, anyone that works in healthcare, I should say, they have a particular way of talking. And I understand when people who are married to someone in medicine who's not in the field will make that observation, say, there's a way that they talk and how they go about and what they talk about that's very medically inclined.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, what I've noticed is that the more that you become siloed into your profession, it inherently limits your perceptions, and you start to have this idea or this belief that your perspective almost encompasses everything, that you view everything through that one lens. And medicine is great. It's great to understand the body, understand people, all those things. But if you're constantly viewing everything from a medical lens, you almost restrict yourself in your ability to not only look at things from a different perspective, but looking at it from a wider range to where you can accurately assess what you're seeing. So if, for instance, if all I ever associate myself was around other people within my field, then I wouldn't meet people in the lodge that were I would say like lawyers, people that were government officials, people that were writers, people who are artists, people who are just, regular, I would say blue collar jobs. You wouldn't have the full spectrum of people to learn from. And based on my experience, the benefit of the lodge as a whole is that you are not only exposed to a wide group of people, but you're able to learn from their individual journeys that have changed throughout time and lessons that they've learned. And in a lot of ways, what I've learned is that you don't have to be a doctor to learn some of these important lessons in life. In medicine, there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of high stress situations that force you to learn very quickly. But what I've noticed is that other people learn those same lessons within their profession, but it's not a life or death situation, but it's equally as profound, but they learn that through a different path. And so for me, it's more the awareness of you don't have to be a doctor to learn the most important lessons. You simply have to be around the right people in the right environment to facilitate you learning those lessons, regardless of where you learn them from.
We're going inside Hermann Hesse's timeless classic Siddhartha with brother Jonathan Kopel on this episode of the Craftsmen Online podcast. You'll notice that the title for this one talks about the river of wisdom. And we're going to get into some of the symbolism that can be found inside this book and, again, how that overlays with Masonic lessons. The river plays a crucial symbolic role in this book. How do you see the concept of stream of tradition or flow of knowledge that gets mentioned connecting with Freemasonry?
That, I think, is a good question. I would say that if you took the ritual as is without context, I don't think you would have that perception initially for different reasons. I think that the flow of all these different things, like the perceptions that you talked about coming together, I think that comes through taking a step back, even from our own religious perspective, and looking at it from a more, I'd rather not say esoteric because that has a lot of connotations in different ways, but I would say maybe broadly a more mystical perspective. In other words, looking at from more of an experiential perspective of what we define as God or what we define as something beyond what we typically perceive. And I think that the more you look at it from that perspective, it's much easier to see how religion has not only changed, but also looking at how our understandings in different faith traditions, even in things like shamanism, or I've been exposed to things in, like Haitian voodoo. Have you ever met any, any of the brothers in DC that practice that?
I have met them.
Yourself?
Yes, I've not seen it or been exposed. It's something I'd be interested in learning or even observing, but I've heard them talk about it. Yeah,
I've only seen one time, like the way that they practice Vadu or Voodoo, depending on how you pronounce it. But I bring them up because it's an interesting overlap to having that exposure to a different religious and spiritual perspective and how they practice that. What I realize is that there's not only a lot of overlap to Christianity and some of the types of ideas presented, but there's also different things that are emphasized that you can pull from that then when you reflect on your own tradition or different traditions, you can see a little bit clearer different ideas that were there, but you hadn't noticed before. So I
Okay.
think sometimes that flow of perception in general is less about gaining more knowledge as having a few ideas that stimulate your awareness to where you then perceive everything that was already there to begin with, but you hadn't been cued to perceive it yet.
Gotcha. The other thing that I was thinking about the stream of tradition and kind of like the flow of knowledge, just in a very simple context, is the idea of, Siddhartha kind of saying, "Hey, look, I have to go take my own steps. I have to learn by myself. I have to experience life to really understand what it is. I can't follow your truth or follow your path, right?" And so many times with things like, well, how come candidates have to walk around the floor in this way because this is how it's always been done? That's the tradition of our ritual. Like, our ritual is tradition. And I
Mhm.
feel like the flow of knowledge is kind of the way that we as master masons communicate the quote unquote deeper meanings, or, hey, do you know what this symbol over here in this area um of the lodge means, or do you know why we do this or why we do that? And it's those little like sideline conversations, those little micro doses of Masonic education that you get. And I feel like that kind of also plays into the flow of knowledge. And that the idea is that, as much as we say, oh, well, you're a master mason, it's like, yeah, but I haven't really fully mastered all of the craft. Yeah, I've basically mastered being really good at being open to learning things, is how I describe it.
I mean, isn't it interesting though? One of the things that, for me practicing the DC ritual, especially in the EA degree, one of the things that stood out to me was like you're describing about how we will talk about, why do we do certain things certain specific ways, or why is the ritual said in this way. What's interesting is that in a general lodge, a lot of people don't necessarily, those conversations aren't necessarily had within like a general Masonic meeting.
Hmm.
But if you look at the DC ritual, it specifically mentions at one point that you're encouraged to learn about this outside of a general lodge kind of arena. You're actually supposed to be having
Hmm.
those discussions with older mentors to be able to learn and to grow. And I think that's one of the things that really stood out to me was a good mentor in that regard is one that is open to having those discussions outside the lodge in a way that not only stimulates your appreciation for the ritual, but lets you know the importance of learning and seeking yourself, so that if you have that question, that becomes an opportunity for yourself to learn. And quite frankly, I've had other mentors who are way more knowledgeable than me, experienced Masonically, have done more degrees, whatever. But I'll mention something and they'll say, "Oh, I've never thought of it that way." And
Mm.
it's the first time they've actually been exposed to someone else saying a different perspective. And even they still are learning after decades of practicing the ritual or working within different lodges to perfect their knowledge and their understanding.
Yeah, and that's a big theme, as you pointed out in this book, Siddhartha, the role of individual enlightenment, the importance of doing the quote unquote inner work of self actualization, discovery, and improvement. Another big one is the concept of listening, and not so much as like being spatially aware that things are happening in your life, but like really listening, as in Buddhism, as they say, like seek to understand. Except in this one they talk about finding the Om. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, or the
Yeah,
Om.
the or the Om. Yeah.
So what is that? And what is, I'm guessing that has something to do with the concept of like inner reflection or contemplation. And do we do any of that in our lodges or in our Masonic work?
So the word when you think about it, it's more of the idea. I actually have the quote from the book, and it's about the idea of perfection. And
Mm.
in a lot of, and this is where I find interesting differences between Eastern and Western philosophies. In Western philosophies, there is a very odd tendency to label things as that's objectively good and that's objectively bad. There's good and evil, and there's
Hmm.
just one thing that you have to, always go for good. The Eastern philosophies, interestingly, will take a perspective that's much more inclusive, and they'll say, well, is it really all bad or good, or is it really the way that you perceive it and you understand its purpose and how even what we perceive as being bad, it for another person can be good? And the way I kind of view this as a doctor is saying, yes, I get to treat people. For them, it sucks. They have to go to the hospital and they have to go to the doctor. For me, it's more of, oh, this is an opportunity for me to learn and help someone who's actually in need. So is it really good or bad? It's kind of hard to really say. It's more of, it is what it is. And I think the idea of being this kind of perfection is being at peace with having these dichotomies in life and saying it is what it is, but it's more about what I do with this moment, this experience, to then project that forward into something good. In other words, it's less about labeling and it's more about accepting what happens and then using that experience to guide how you love and care for other people. At least that's one way I think you could interpret it. Now, you mentioned how we do that in the lodge. I think one of the ways that I see this is more about how we do the ritual, in that you may have some people that are more experienced and people that are less experienced, and everybody's learning at their own pace. Even though there can be some mishaps when you're doing the ritual, things aren't always perfect. Even people who've done it for a long time. The whole thing, as long as there's an order and that people are helping and that things progress forward, eventually it ends. And even when we've done rituals or degrees, as long as you hit the ending right amongst all the different things, then usually most people leave feeling very well about it. And I think of that as sort of the ultimate idea, is that despite all the imperfections or perfections, that we find satisfaction in being in the experience and in the moment that we're able to, and not necessarily drifting off to what's happening outside the lodge, which is, again, one of the things that they do at the beginning of the lodge, is opening and closing the lodge, is that side of behavior is to establish that. So I think in one way you can think of as that kind of being in the moment, being present with whatever happens, and not necessarily focusing on labeling, well, that was really good or really bad, and just saying, well, people are learning at their own pace and all time, and we're all working together towards a common goal.
So inner peace, you touched on that a few times. It's a big major theme. It's kind of like the last thing I wanted to close out for this book discussion. And we do talk about that Masonically of, I think that's the goal. As you look at the allegory of building your symbolic temple, there's a lot of discussion around that. Like, oh, well, I don't know if my temple got completed. I'm a master mason now. I don't understand. It's like, no, you wouldn't have been able to become a master mason unless you did this work. I mean, yes, in a practical sense, is it possible to complete your Masonic temple in 3 months from when you took your last degree to do, you have to put the work in to perfect this, or, to get the job complete, so to speak. But I like the idea of achieving inner peace, and I like the idea of tranquility of mind. And a lot of that is kind of to what you're touching on as well, is the idea of accepting and forgiving, and that not just in others, but also in yourself. And I think of the Masonic tools that we have, the working tools that are made available to us to kind of understand this. So you've got the square, you've got the compasses, and the idea of your passions and due bounds, and regulating things and being aware of what your weaknesses are, and trying to be present and with the intent of being better and being cautious and being respectful and mindful. Can you elaborate a little bit? Were you picking up any of those gems while you were reading Siddhartha and hitting some of those key points?
I think yes. I would say that the main lesson I've learned from discussions with mentors, is particularly one mentor, is that ultimately Freemasonry is not about an end goal, it's about process. And I think that's the word I always think about. If someone describes what is Freemasonry, I says Freemasonry is a process, not an end goal. Because I think that's why we talk about in the lodge about, the end goal, about going to the east or all those things. But like you mentioned, something I just thought of, Hymer Abiff, or not even Hymer Abiff, but a lot of the ruffians, they never get the secret word of a master mason. They just think
Yeah.
that it's never revealed. There's certain things that are never discussed, right? And the question is, well, why is that? If we're supposed to be seeking perfection, then why aren't these things completed? And the common theme amongst all these things is that the tools and everything that you're given, the immortality of the soul, all these things are about saying it's not the end goal that matters. It's the process that you're in the current moment working on. And that's what matters most of all. And it's the same thing about who you are as a person that is being discovered through whatever thing that you're working on at that moment. And that's a different way of perceiving it than looking for an ultimate goal, but saying, I'm going to focus on the process by which I'm trying to understand who I am. And it reminds me about the habits and the tools that we're given. In a way, I think of it more as these are the tools in the process by which you try to attempt to understand what's going on in the present without necessarily expecting there to be a final endpoint to it all. And so I think that's where I would say you find a greater depth of meaning is by viewing Freemasonry, life, whatever you look at, even God. It's a process of being in the moment, of being in that continued search and understanding, than saying, oh, well, this is the final answer or this is the achievement. Because think about that, when you become a master, even within your lodge, besides being, the district deputy or being the grandmaster of your district or whatever, there's not much else you can really point to, right? There's not an escalation, you go highest to the highest point, right? So the question becomes, what do I do next after I've achieved everything? And for me, it's always a reminder of learning how to be in the moment, but then also in conjunction with that, understanding what process is going on and how can I facilitate myself being in harmony with that process. So in other words, in the lodge, we talk about different members. There's different positions in the lodge that all have their specific function. Each one has an important point or important role to fit that if it's not done right, the whole lodge can't operate. Even the least of, like, for instance, the role of me being master of ceremonies. Yes, you're not the worshipful master, you're not any of like the three major wardens. But at the same time, if you don't do your job right, nothing can go, you can't proceed with the opening and closing of the lodge. Like it will completely stop. Because the master can't do that. The junior and senior wardens can't do those things. You have to be able to do your position well. And it's only with understanding how you fit in the harmony of the process that you start seeing the bigger picture of things. If you look at a lot of traditions, especially in Siddhartha, the idea of understanding the process and the flow of life is by taking a bigger step beyond yourself and seeing how your small contributions in life fit into something larger.
Dude, I was just gonna go there. That's amazing. Because
I stole your thunder, though. I'm sorry.
No. You just threw the match on the gas because I was already like, man, I can't wait to get into this part of it with you, because we hear a lot in Freemasonry. A lot of the lessons are how to interact with our fellow man or in our communities or just other people, right? And we're taught to be gracious and forgiving and all of these wonderful, great qualities. But there's one person that we don't really learn directly about how to really listen to or be better to, and that's to ourself. And that's the one point that we're making, is I feel too often men today, and probably throughout time, we can become overly critical of ourselves. Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did this. I totally let myself down. I forgot about my partner's birthday. I bounced, my checking account is overdrawn. I hit a curb trying to parallel park the other day. These little dumb things that we do, and we're like, oh, man, I'm just beating myself up because I've made a mistake. But then we don't sit there and go, man, you know what? You really, if you could hug yourself today, you probably should, because you spent however many months memorizing 30 minutes of a ritual part, or you worked with this one guy who really needed someone just to listen to a tough day or a loss of a family member, and you were for them. Like, good for you being a and we to what you're saying is like these little moments where we do make impacts in the lives of others and we never see it. We never really take a step back and be like, that provides, I know it's a different kind of tranquility of mind, but it's the accepting of I'm doing good because I am good, because being good is also a part of what's inside of me.
I I was writing about this today. If you look at, sometimes in Christianity or other traditions, they talk about human beings being a reflection of God, or in Eastern traditions, they talk about like you being divine itself.
Mm,
And it's always been weird to me because, I'm a doctor, and see, I'm like, look, I can't create the universe. I'm not this all powerful being. But the more I thought about it, it's not about you somehow being God. It's the idea of you're in process of being aware of those qualities that matter the most. And that's the part that is the most important. And like you were saying, is that we focus on all of our imperfections, but then at the same time, what I realize is that those imperfections are often where you learn the most important lessons. If you're always constantly thinking of perfection, you're basically not looking at anything that is meaningful. It's sort of like having a bright light shining on you. If everything is bright, you're not going to see anything. It's the contrast that teach you the most important lessons overall. And when I think about that in how I practice in the hospital or what I learn each day, what I realize is that most of the time we discount the simple acts of listening and realizing how even the very fact of not saying anything and just listening to someone can have more impact for that entire person's life than you spouting off a million different lessons, right?
hmm
Because I think sometimes, especially in our culture, we think, oh, I need to know the technique, or I need to know just the data to get me through. Most of the time, what I've seen is that people are so busy and people are so focused on fixing problems that sometimes they come to the hospital and they're just thankful that someone listened, because they've had all these thoughts, they've had all these problems, and sometimes they just need someone to sit there,
Mm.
regardless of who they are, and to really just soak in what they're going through and sometimes say, hey, that sounds really rough. What is it that you're really looking for? It's questions like that I found lead to the best headway of fixing problems, because most of the time, the real problem is not what we think the problem is. It's the underlying unspoken existential
Mm.
question that no one's really poked at. Once you get there, I think for us all, that's where we find the greatest peace and relief overall.
The book is Siddhartha. It's written by Brother Hermann Hesse. If you want to read Brother Jonathan's Masonic book report on the Craftsmen Online blog, just go ahead and open up the player that you're listening on. In that description, you'll find our show notes. Bang, there's a link right there to get to Craftsmen Online and read more about this. Brother Jonathan, I got to say, man, we called this the River of Wisdom, and you definitely did not disappoint. Thank you once again for being our captain and our guide on this episode.
No, thank you for hosting this too. It's always nice to, I view it more as sharing something that hopefully people find useful. Um, I certainly have a lot to learn, but at least I felt like this was one book that I think resonated and kind of encapsulated a lot of the lessons I've learned over the last couple of years.
Perfect. That was good, man. That was really
Yeah.
good. All right. I'm trying to think. So this won't come out until May. I just realized, at least that's what it says here. That could change. I have